I think you need a revolution in your attitude to the state.
What we actually need to do is to think about the way that we structure our economy.
What would a really radical left offer on the economy look like?
We are meeting at a time when the centre-left across Europe is in a bit of a mess. It's electorally weak pretty well across the board. I do think that we should think aloud about how we see the political landscape developing, and who better to discuss what the future might hold for Labour and the centre-left than my old friend Lord Maurice Glassman. We will be entertained and informed by Maurice, as we always are. So, Maurice, over to you.
I was really excited about coming to Budapest because it's the birthplace of Karl Polanyi, who wrote The Great Transformation. And the Great Transformation was perhaps the most important book, obviously outside the Bible, that I've ever, the Old Testament that is, that I've ever read. Karl Polanyi was the one, I think, and will become the most important of those 20th century thinkers. And the reason he was the most important, I think, was that he was the one who understood that the state and the market are allies in the process of the destruction of society. It used to be the case that we could, in our Fabian moment, that we could say that the rational planning of the economy was superior to the capitalist planning because it removed duplication and it satisfied need. But Polanyi was witness to the debate with Hayek and with von Mises, which goes under the heading, the really catchy heading, of the socialist calculation debate in the 1920s. And in the socialist calculation debate, where there was Kautsky on one side and a whole series of socialist economies, essentially just think of Ed Balls on acid. What they thought was you could have really, they were very futuristic, very H.G. Wells-like, and essentially you could put all the data into an as yet uninvented computer, and you could calculate human need. And that was the superiority of socialism to capitalism. And von Mises, with Hayek by his side, said, but how can you understand or even know what people want unless you have a price system? But the argument was more profound. The argument was that without a fluctuating price system based on supply and demand, you couldn't conceivably know what people wanted, and that would lead to stagnation, a lack of innovation, inefficiency, and ultimately the domination of managers over workers. It turned out to be actually quite an accurate description of socialism as it came. So this is my point. Social democracy, as it stands, I think the situation is quite severe, has neither an understanding of the social nor of democracy. And what I mean by that is that the state became everything. And in the absence of the political economy, the welfare state becomes everything. And this leads our parties into a terrible position. And the challenge for the left is to say that there is such a thing as society. There are such things as institutions that embody public goods. There are such things as traditions that guide us in the way to make things well of good practice.
I think it says something very profound about freedom and society. That's why inequality matters.
It's all about identity politics.
What's essential is that socialists rediscover the social.
Thank you very much. I hope you'll forgive me. Being a historian, I will start not with the present situation, God forbid, but with what happened years and years and years ago. And maybe go straight to what I think is one of the most important things about the left in its historical dimension. It's innate schizophrenia. The program was based on two different approaches. On the one hand, these parties said we are anti-capitalist. we want to destroy the capitalist system, or we have to wait until the capitalist system collapses. Fundamentally, that was the idea for the long term of what was called the maximum program. But they all also agreed on the so-called minimum program. That is, meanwhile, what on earth are we going to do while capitalism develops? Now, one of the problems with this is that the more you are successful with the minimum program, in other words, the more you reform capitalism, then the less, obviously, the necessity for a strong anti-capitalist point of view. If a system only caters for 10% of the population, then you can have 90% eventually on your side. But if a system actually causes the poverty of only 20%, as is probably the case now, then the actual majority have a stake in it. So in a way, the socialist parties helped to lengthen the life cycle of capitalism, stabilize it, and so on and so forth. Throughout the period, which goes from 1889, if we want to take that, to the Second World War, the left was hardly ever in power. So we have a strange thing. Capitalism triumphs throughout the 20th century. It grows, develops, and eventually everybody accepts the inevitability of capitalism with different positions and different points of views about what this capitalism should be. That somehow, from a position of minority before 1945, if not complete irrelevancy, the left after the Second World War becomes a force to be reckoned, and indeed the minimum program, the traditional minimum program of social democracy, not only coexisted with capitalism, but actually needed a strong capitalist system which developed. The more it developed, the better. The great paradox of the left is that the left needs a strong capitalist system. So that way we can tax and spend. There is a phenomenon which is embracing the whole of Europe, especially the whole of Western Europe, in which the two main political forces together absorb fewer and fewer numbers of the electorate. That is, that the traditional force of the right has lost votes, usually to so-called xenophobic or anti-immigrant or anti-European parties. There is also a growth of the far left in a number of countries. Particularly the electoral system is favorable. It is now, the opinion polls suggest that Podemos in Spain, a party which was invented only 2 years ago, is the first party. Another opinion poll in Greece says that Syriza might win the next election. So that that not only the conservative parties are not able to absorb the vote of the dissidents on the right, but the left, the traditional left-wing parties, are not able to absorb the vote of the far left. In other words, we have an increased disintegration of the traditional party political system in Europe.
I would say that one of the defining characteristics of our politics in the last 20 years or so is the extent to which metropolitan liberalism of both centre-left and centre-right, partly reflecting the interests of what one might call the upper professional class, has captured too much of politics. One of the consequences of that is that across Western Europe, less well-educated people on lower incomes who tend to be more attached to what I have called popular liberalism have deserted the social democratic parties, dominated now by metropolitan liberalism. Let me just briefly describe, it's obviously incredibly sketchy, my metropolitan liberalism and my popular liberalism. Metropolitan liberalism, I've given rather arbitrarily 7 defining points. Point 1, change is generally beneficial, and although globalization has disadvantages and creates losers, this can be mitigated by wise policy, and there are more winners than losers. 2, individual autonomy and self-realization is the goal of politics, and indeed of life. Freedom is about the removal of constraint. Point 3, maximizing individual aspiration and social and geographical mobility are amongst the main priorities of modern politics. 4, although it's true that few metropolitan liberals are full-blown cosmopolitans, they tend to favour wide but thin attachments and are often suspicious of group allegiances. 5, they tend to support need before contribution in welfare. 6, they prefer equality before fraternity in politics, although, at least for the centre-right, that doesn't extend to income equality. Point 7, that which is freely chosen generally has a higher value than that which is given. Tradition is usually an obstacle to progress. The ideology of popular liberalism, I would maintain, is still liberal. Many popular liberals may be UKIP voters. I don't think that necessarily makes them not liberal. They believe in the rule of law, they believe in rights, they believe in minority rights, they believe in individual autonomy, freedom of expression, they distrust power. However, point 1 of my definition of popular liberalism is change is loss. Of course, this is not always the case. The modern world is better than the old one in most respects, but suspicion of change is perfectly rational for those who benefit from it least. Popular liberalism places a high value on security and stability in living arrangements and reciprocity in human relations. Freedom requires structure. Individual achievement is sought and respected, but the main goal in life is human association and being recognized in significant ways. The best and brightest rise to the top, but all contribution is valued, vocation and virtue as much as aspiration. Point 4, popular liberals are moral particularists. They value those close to them more than those who are distant. Point 5, contribution before need in welfare. Point 6, fraternity before equality in politics, though popular liberals generally believe in the moral equality of all humans. Point 7, tradition often represents the wisdom of past generations. Legitimate authority and hierarchy deserve respect. Now, of course, in the real world, few of us belong completely to either metropolitan or popular liberalism. Most people are a mixture of the two. Having said that, things don't really happen in politics unless they have a reasonably strong backing from the metropolitan liberal side of the argument. We have sucked, unintentionally, but partly through the dominance of metropolitan liberalism, we have sucked honour and dignity and pay as well out of a huge number of middling and basic jobs that we still desperately need to be done. To succeed in Britain, you have to leave where you came from in most cases, unless you come from Surrey. You have to leave to succeed, which again sort of fits into the metropolitan worldview. And a lot of these things are very complicated, unavoidable problems, perhaps of any industrial society, but we have not addressed them with the rigour that they deserve, because I think the people that run the country's interests are not sufficiently engaged. Metropolitan liberalism has not had everything its own way in recent years, and actually I think in some areas of public debate, of policy, we actually have a rather more sensible position than we did. But many of these changes in recent years have actually, alas, been driven not by the centre-left, but actually by the centre-right. And that is a problem. I mean, from my point of view, that is a problem. And in the final question I want to address now is really, is it too late for Labour to become a party, a popular liberal party, if you like?
The one thing to say is that I do think that there's been a profound distrust of the people, particularly working class people, dominating Labour's outlook. That's been going on for some time. But I do think we do have to explain the kind of Gordon Brown bigot sneer point and the Emily Thornberry white van man sneer point. And the reason why everybody recognised that was because they knew that it spoke to something that was just profoundly true, which is that there is a sneer that goes on about the vast majority of people in Britain from the elites, and in this instance, from the left. And there's two ways that I think that's happened, or various ways I think that's happened. One is that I think that the left indulged in a demonisation of individual aspiration. I think that there's become a social policy that's based on a lack of trust in individuals as autonomous decision makers. and the politics of behaviour have been led by, and the micromanaging of lifestyle has been led by the left. And I want to look at cultural estrangement, and more broadly, the kind of culture wars. So just because I think it's important for me, at least, to say that one left narrative is that kind of rugged individualism is bad and all collective communal forms are good. And I think that that is hopelessly inadequate, and I want to defend individualism. One of the things that happens in relation to Thatcherism, and all of the critiques of Thatcherism that one gets today from the left, was that anybody who wanted to better their lives was a problem. And so that seems to me to be very problematic. And a kind of anti-working class assault that started early on, that material aspiration is vulgar, that working to improve the life of your family and so on is somehow venal, and to kind of use a phrase, that Thatcher encouraged amongst the working classes, quote, a credit-fueled consumer binging junkies generation. So actually that sneer started as an explanation for the abandonment of Labour to voting for Thatcher. I think that one of the things we've witnessed over recent years has been a major assault on agency. The metropolitan elite are trying to help us because we're not up to it. And that we don't really know how to feed our children. And we're going to give them McDonald's if we're left to our own devices. We don't really know how to rear them properly because we haven't been on a parenting class. But this has been all at the expense of agency and individual freedom, and has basically turned ordinary people into kind of people to be done to, rather than able to history-making subjects. So, if we used to say that the past was a foreign country, my point is that the present is a foreign country for most people who live, particularly in Britain. And when you say that, people will often think you're referring to the fact that people feel they do not feel at home in their own country because of immigration. Now, I don't mean that. I mean because of an alien kind of tone in political debate that people just don't relate to, can't understand how it's happened, and are made to feel as though they are to blame for it. So my point is, sadly, when it comes to the culture wars and cultural alienation, the left have led the charge and have treated the working class with contempt. And I think now that the vast majority of ordinary people will treat the Labour Party with the contempt which, to be honest, they deserve.
The good news is that your story is confirmed academically by a report recently published by the Scientific Council for the Dutch government, which published a report about separate worlds between higher educated and lower educated. It's an official government document about the new social-cultural divide in our society, in the Dutch society. The report shows also, and that confirms the latest speaker, that the higher educated academic professionals suffer from feelings of unease within an egalitarian society. There's an awkward feeling because the academic professionals, they tend to lock themselves up in their own biotope, from which they look disdainful down at the lower educated. The academic professionals and lower educated clash around what the report calls the topics of globalization, the globalization issues, which is open borders, immigration, and a European integration process. And then they speak about two separate social-cultural families which oppose each other, the one cosmopolitan and universalistic, and the other nationalistic and particularistic. There are, however, some problems with this analysis, and I will use my intervention for some more critical comments, because one of the problems I have with the analysis is that it's a black-white polarization. Another problem is there's a bias also in this government report because all the academics are left-wing. Okay, so there's an enormous bias of progressive academics on this scheme, is my point. Second point I want to make is a story about honesty. There's also a story of honesty of urban professionals. I witnessed two kinds of hypocrisy of urban professionals in this debate. There's a hypocrisy of urban professionals in terms of the cosmopolitanism and in terms of libertarianism. For me, the big question is, are the urban professionals, are they really that cosmopolitan? Are they really that pro-EU? Are they really that much pro-immigration and pro-Islam? In my intellectual circles, nobody is really interested in European politics. But they are very much pro-EU, but they don't give a damn about European politics. They think it's the most boring topic there is, and they are right. So it's all about identity politics. These positions on cosmopolitanism, universalism, they sound very good. They sound, we are the good people, and we are not the bad people. But in fact, if you analyze them deeply, profoundly, it's bollocks. Mostly these people are not cosmopolitan or pro-migration or pro-Islam. So we should be much more honest about our own convictions and positions. The second hypocrisy of the urban professionals has to do with libertarianism. That's a big tragedy. That the urban professionals, they have libertarian outlooks, but they don't live libertarian lives. Yeah, as we do. And the other way, it's completely the other way around for the underclass. They have non-libertarian outlooks, but they live libertarian lives. So that's a very tragic irony. Another important point I want to make is, and that's, you are leaving out the, I think, a very important category out of your equation, which are the migrants. They are not into this picture of the two liberalisms. And they are very important to understand the whole picture. They substituted the working class by migrants. So they said, in the times of Donald Sassoon, we had this coalition alliance of solidarity between the higher educated or professionals and the working class, but we substituted the working class for migrants. They are now the new good people, they are the subject of solidarity. Completely substituted by the working class. Even worse, we say the working class, our former heroes, are now the racists. Because we went into this anti-racist cultural war in the 70s and 80s, rightly so, but there's a complete substitution of working class and migrants. So we have a much more complex alliance within the left. We now have a coalition of atheist feminists supporting Muslim parties. That's what we have.
So we had this financial crisis, but I think that sort of gave the left permission to talk about a kind of broader set of things. And I guess it kind of led to this debate and this realisation on the centre-left that markets only kind of really produce what you put into them. And there's no such thing as kind of a fair outcome. So essentially the wage distribution in the economy. And the centre-left sort of agenda, I guess, around responsible capitalism was really around the idea that capitalism should become more inclusive and more balanced. I think, you know, what that sort of developed into was there was this idea, there's this idea inherent, I suppose, in shareholder capitalism that people who own companies are going to be holding management to account for what goes on. And what we've seen actually is that shareholder capitalism has become much more something akin to asset manager capitalism, where the people kind of voting in boardrooms, they're taking decisions based on trading shares, year-to-year profits, rather than really thinking about the long term. So I think it's quite helpful to start by kind of asking, well, what would a really radical kind of left offer on the economy look like? I think on small business finance, you might see a sort of proper state-backed small business investment bank. I think you might see a much greater emphasis on industrial policy. I think you could see quite a radical approach to investment and pensions. I think you might see also reforms to corporate governance. I think you'd see a whole set of policies around wage inequalities. I think the housing market, you'd see reform of the land market, and you'd see significant reform of housing taxation. So I think given actually there are some pretty different elements to this agenda that does sort of seem to represent a move away from the third way. I guess some of the question is, well, why isn't this really taking off in the way that some on the centre-left would like to see? And I think, first of all, I think there are sort of four real issues, but I think, first of all, there's a real need to give it a popular appeal. But I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and I think what it's led to is an overemphasis on blaming individuals for the financial crisis, and a bit less of a focus on the structural issues that have caused these things. And I think that does take you to solutions like the banker's bonus tax, like the energy price freeze, which are actually very, very popular, but don't really get to the core issues, I suppose, of what the issues are. I think it also takes you to taxes that are more marginal, like the mansion tax. And I think it takes you to an election campaign that's focused much more on kind of cash in pockets, rather than what do we want our economy to look like in 30 years. So I think that's an issue. I think there's a second issue, which is where does a radical offer actually take us, and where does it get us to? And I think the truth is that there are sort of real questions about that. So I guess over the last, 4 or 5 years, the end thing on the left has been to look at Germany and say, Germany's great, we really like the kind of long-termism that's built into the German economy, and we would like to emulate some of that over here. But I think there are actually some really important technical questions, which is actually, well, do we really know how to get there? That requires long-termism. And if you're interested in long-term structural reform of the economy, you need to be able to do long-term policies. I think actually British politics has never felt further away from being able to deliver really long-term structural reforms. I think a third issue is I think there's a question about how much there is that distinguishes mainstream left and right on this agenda. And last, I think there is this consensus now that we need to deliver significant public spending cuts. And I think that raises a real challenge for the left. There are some really important conflicts between big public spending cuts and some of the responsible capitalism agenda. So I think on the demand side as well, so looking at public demand for kind of more radical offer, I suppose, I think first of all, we haven't really seen public anger about the financial crisis and frustration with living standards translate into kind of a really active demand for something different. So for example, I think that Occupy protests were sort of notable for their failure to capture the wider public imagination. And I also think a real problem is that I think people are kind of more cynical about politicians at the moment than they are about the economy that they're trying to fix.
The last few years, I think, have been really fascinating, watching the way that the left responds to the financial crisis and tries to understand 2008. And the left asks itself a lot, why have we lost this debate? And hidden in that is the assumption that we're fundamentally right and we've just not been tactically clever in how we've gone about prosecuting it as a public discussion. And actually, I don't think that's true. I think the reason we lost the debate in 2008 because we don't really understand what happened in 2008. It was really what happens when you have a post-growth economy with all of the intergenerational challenges which come with that, is faced with very high growth economies in the southeast. To put it another way, if every bank was wholly staffed by entirely good and entirely capable people, we would have still had a financial crisis of the same scale and same scope, largely. There may have been some marginal differences. I did some research earlier in the year, just out of interest, where I looked for correlations between certain characteristics of crisis impact, so most obviously fiscal loss, GDP loss, and absolute GDP in 2008, and looked at it for correlations against kind of characteristics of those economies in the years preceding. And interestingly, the things which are strongly correlated are an inverse correlation with growth, a positive correlation with a trade deficit, a positive correlation with a credit deficit, and a positive correlation with government spending. There is almost no correlation, it's just under 0.2, almost no correlation with the size of a financial services sector in an economy. So my point is, if we as a group believe that the whole response, I'm sure none of us believe the whole response, or the dominant response to an event like 2008 is constraint within a specific sector and management changes and rigor and regulation, all of which need to be done, absolutely. But if we think that that is sufficient rather than necessary, we're kidding ourselves. What we actually need to do is to think about the way that we structure our economy, the way that we go about interacting with the rest of the world, and fundamentally how we think about our internal exposures between generations, how we think about the size of the state, which is, I regret to say, too big in that kind of post-crisis environment.
I do think that in Hungary, the problem is that we had a party that was defined and led by the metropolitan elite, if you like. It was a free democratic, the party of free democrats. And they represented as a dogma European-style liberalism, mixed conservative economics, and some social liberalism on the side. This venture failed miserably. It could not capture either the attention or the affection of the Hungarian electorate. Why? Well, it's not so difficult to see that in a transition economy where everything changes rather hectically, neoliberal dogma and emphasis on human rights is just not an adequate answer to any of the questions that people might come up with, such as frustration with the local environment, employability, family issues, housing issues, and so on. I think the basic issue here is trust. Can we trust political elites? No, we don't trust political elites. Can we trust the justice system? No, here in Hungary, we do not trust the justice system. Can we trust the distribution system, redistribution, if you like, but just distribution in general? That there is some meritocracy, that there is some justice, there is an equitable distribution. No, we cannot. Do we pay taxes? No, absolutely, we do not want to pay taxes to a government that we cannot trust. Can we make business? No, we absolutely cannot make business, because we can only make business with people who know that we are going to cheat on the taxes, right? And we do not trust each other on that. There are several aspects to what a politician should do, and especially shouldn't do, that is required to gain trust. But it's beyond, so I would emphasize the role of the individual politicians. So it's not all policy wonks, it's not about the bureaucracy, it's individual leadership. We don't have that on the left here. I don't know if you have that on the left in Britain, but I do believe that without this kind of trust, and if you like, personal trust, issues that are important to anyone left of center, and I am left of center, cannot be put on the agenda. They just simply will fly away.
The inequality picture is slightly more nuanced than the popular discussion, which is a sort of continually upward path of inequality. The OECD says the gap between the rich and poor is now at the highest level in 30 years in most OECD countries. This long-term trend increase in income inequality has curbed economic growth significantly. While the overall increase in income inequality is also driven by the very rich 1% pulling away, what matters most for growth are families with lower incomes slipping behind. And they say it's not just the bottom 10%, but the bottom 40%. So what's happening? There's a number of drivers. The first is technology. Technology is a very significant driver. Globalization is less of a factor than technology, potentially, but a small factor nonetheless. And divergence in education and skills is critical. Wage growth is very uneven. And if you look at the sort of annual averages of wage growth from the mid-1990s to the late 2000s, at the bottom you see sort of wage increases in the sort of 1% mark across countries, and you see wages in the top decile of increases of 2%. Now, between just over 1% to 2% doesn't sound very much as a difference, but over a period of 30-odd years, that makes a big difference in terms of inequality. What is happening here? Well, there is a change in power within the marketplace. The decline of collective unionisation is critical. Sectoral change matters too, the movement from sectors that are highly union-dominated to those that aren't, and movement from sectors that where there is high productivity and the wages to go to that, to sectors where are lower skill, lower wage. And we don't seem to have a labour market structure that can deliver middle-class wages for lower skilled employment in the way in the 50s and 60s may well have been commonplace. Why does it matter? It says something about the way power is distributed in our society. Something very important. If we lived in a truly free society, would we have the wage structure and spread of wealth that we currently have? My argument is not. My argument is that certain groups are able to manipulate their power in order to secure greater rewards for themselves. So I think it says something very profound about freedom and society. That's why inequality matters. It matters for growth and productivity. It causes financial instability. It could well, in fact, it almost certainly does lead to family pressure and breakdown. If you're struggling to make ends meet, your family life is going to be under more pressure. It matters from that perspective. This is perpetuated over generations, and so we're creating social divides over time. Yeah. So, solutions. I'm going to first say two big solutions that I don't think are available to us. One is Piketty's solution, and Piketty's contribution to this debate was to look at wealth and financial capital as a driver of inequality. His solution was a global wealth tax. Good luck with that. So let's move on to the next one. The traditional way of reducing inequality, and the reason for some of the success in the early 2000s, is you tax and redistribute. I don't think that's realistically on the table in any major way. The political barriers are too great, the financial barriers are too great, the context isn't there. So instead, I'm going to propose a series of changes that together constitute a whole society approach to reducing inequality and giving people greater power over their lives in the marketplace. This involves work, assets, skills, and social support. Work, we need support around wage, and some of these themes have come up, and I think they apply to the inequality debate as much as they do to the economy debate, actually. Support for wages, new powers for local authorities and LEPs. Business needs to come to the party. It's in business's interest as a collective group to increase wages. Ownership matters. This is the assets piece. We've got to give people, and this is the Piketty point, we've got to give people access to capital assets, shares in their firm, a stake in their work, home ownership, increasing house building, but also increasing house ownership as well. Skills, the whole vocational skills system needs to be looked at afresh. And finally, social supports are important. If we're talking about the family, how do we bring people together who are in very difficult situations so they get the sorts of friendship and support in a civil sense when they need it. Finally, just very briefly, it helps to have social democratic government, and it helps to have growth. We may not have access to either in the next few years.
Thank you very much.
When I established the Conservative Home website, which was what I did before I joined the Times, we deliberately chose home as our name, not just because we wanted it to be the homepage of Conservatives, that was one, but the double meaning was actually to challenge that the market, that liberalism, that freedom were the only things that conservatism was about. We wanted to say the home as a conservative institution was as important as so much of what the Conservatives understood from the Thatcher-Reagan eras. Now, I don't know what, if we went around this table, and I'm not proposing that we do, but what symbols there would be of the left that would convey your core purposes. And then, just on a sort of a practical level, just look who's winning office at the moment. It isn't the left. I think the left is in trouble, which is why I would urge the left to think very deeply about its future. And in this, I've chosen 6 words that I think sum up leftism's values, and I just want to briefly run through them and say, perhaps for each of these 6 left-wing values, whether you need to reapply them. So the first one is diversity. Diversity is something you value. I go to Labour conferences and all I meet are public sector union people who have had a life in politics. Diversity takes on many forms. And if your staff is policy, in my view, if you have people who all have the same backgrounds sat round a table, don't be surprised if you end up with groupthink. My second word for the left is revolution. And I think you need a revolution in your attitude to the state, not to its size, but to what it does. Solidarity is my third word, and I would say a party serious about solidarity cannot be indifferent to the family. The lengths a parent will go for their children will never ever be matched by any state bureaucrat or any state employee. Fourth word, equality. Equality should mean that the elites are less powerful in the future left than they currently are. I think there would be a lot of benefit from being a political party much more open to the views of lots of people rather than just a few people deciding policy. The masses are not anywhere near as wrong as a lot of us in London think they are. Openness, learn from other parties, do data properly. Data is incredibly important in politics. The use of opinion polls is wrong if you use opinion polls to find out what you should believe. They are vital if you want to know and understand what your values are and how to communicate them. And then finally, which isn't a word at all, but I couldn't think of a word that quite captured it, is New Jerusalem-ism. Today really has been fascinating, and I'm very grateful to have been invited here by David and by John. But you guys need to cheer up. Low wages, inequality, austerity. You know, the left is is talking about some pretty hard. Where's the joy? Where is the hope? Where is the vision of something much better? I think, I'm a conservative, I'm supposed to be the one who thinks everything's getting worse and we should all live in the 1950s. There's not a time I would rather live than now.